To everyone online, thanks for joining us once again. I know last week I mentioned that we were doing things a little different, but I'll tell you that today we don't have fun going on like we did last week. Everybody's back in their normal seats, but I'll say for those that are watching online, if you come and join us sometime, we will gladly give up our seats for you. You know, we'll let you come in and we'll let you have the first pick. And man, we will just wait in the back and you come and see wherever looks good for you. And we'll get you, you can have the first choice of where you would like to sit. Because please come and join us and kick us out of our seats. We welcome that 100%. So I know when we come to church, we kind of have our spot that we look towards that we like. And maybe it's getting dented from us sitting there so often. But please, if you come, we will gladly give that up and sit somewhere else for you. So this morning we are in Joshua chapter 9. So if you'd like to go ahead and open your Bibles there. And while you're turning there, I just want to give just a minute quick recap of everything that we've kind of looked at last week, because I know it's been a week, right? And I know after a week you guys are able to remember everything that was said last week, right? Maybe. I don't see a lot of heads shaking, so you know, it's okay. I heard one time that says that, you know, if you have the sermon on Sunday, if you wait like a couple hours later, they'll be able to give you the gist of it. But if you wait until like Tuesday, they might be able to give you the title if there was one. So maybe they'll at least be able to tell you what passage we're in. So I'll give you all the benefit of the doubt. And we'll say this is for those online that maybe didn't get to join us last week. So last week we finished up chapter 8. And what we've seen in chapter 8, that this was the battle and the victory over the city of Ai. The people, they came back in this chapter, and they're now listening to God's direction once again. And it's because of that. It's because the people are now living under God's direction, and they're actually living in obedience to what He tells them to do. You know, they're not the ones trying to call the shots anymore. They're listening to God, and because of that, God gives them another victory. And this victory looks just as easy as it was the first time. You know, I would almost even say this victory looked even easier than it did the first time. Because you got to think, in Jericho, they had to march around the walls. And yeah, that doesn't look that hard either, but you know, that was still some effort that they had to put in. This time, God gave them the directions. They just had to set up pretty much an ambush for them. And man, they got the victory this time so easily. Then at the end of the chapter, what we had seen is after they gained the victory, you know, after they claimed the city, instead of moving forward and thinking about, okay, what's next? The people, they stopped. They remembered the words of Moses back in Deuteronomy, and they carried out those words, and they followed it exactly the way that it was said. They built an altar the way that they were instructed to build an altar. They wrote the laws on stones, and they set it before all the people. The whole nation was gathered together, and they had one half of it was Mount Gerizim, and they had the other half, which was Mount Ebal. And if you remember from last week, we had, that's why we were kind of divided a little bit last week, because we had the side of the blessings and we had the side of the cursings. And I told you all, at least you made an uninformed decision when you walked in. That doesn't mean that you chose the cursings. That was just what happened. So, and then in the middle, between these two mountains, they had the valley in between. And in between, they had the Ark of the Covenant, which represented God's presence in the middle of it all. So last week we had seen at the end that was just a visualization showing how we have a choice to make each and every day. We get to either live in the side of the blessings or we can live in the side of cursings. You know, God gave us the law. We get to read and understand it, and I'm so thankful that we have the law written down. You know, we're not told to memorize it. God knows that we're a people that forget, but we have it written down so we can go to it often. We're supposed to be in His Word often. I hope and pray for each of you that it's every single day you're getting into the Word and you're studying and you're learning it. And, you know, this should be your daily bread that you are taking in and learning from. So, If you do that, that is how you know that you will continue to walk the path that he wants you to be on. Then we've seen that. It says that Joshua, he read aloud to everyone the law. And I really like how it said that. It says that there was not a word of all that Moses commanded, which Joshua read not before all the congregation of Israel. He didn't leave anything out. He didn't skip over anything. He gave it to them exactly the way God had said. And I really like that because, that is our goal every Sunday morning when we come here. The goal is never to you just leave parts out. The goal is always to just give it to you the way that God said and to read everything according to the Word. That is always our goal. So, then we're coming into chapter 9. Right before this, they had victory. They had been brought back to worship. They built the altar to worship God. They got back into God's word because they got back into the law that was given to them. And now they're walking in the right direction and they're walking in obedience. And then we get to Joshua chapter 9 and we're going to see what happens next. So, if you would, please read with me verses 1 through 13. And it says, "And it came to pass when all the kings which were on this side Jordan, in the hills and in the valleys, and in all the coasts of the great sea, over against Lebanon, the Hittite and the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite heard thereof, that they gathered themselves together to fight with Joshua and with Israel with one accord. And when the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done unto Jericho and to Ai, they did work willily, and went and made as if they had been ambassadors, and took old sacks upon their asses, and wine bottles, old and rent and bound up, and old shoes, and clouded upon their feet, and old garments upon them. And all the bread of their provisions was dry and moldy. And they went to Joshua unto the camp at Gilgal, and said unto him and to the men of Israel, We be come from a far country. Now, therefore, make ye a league with us. And the men of Israel said unto the Hivites, Peradventure ye dwell among us, and how shall we make a league with you? And they said unto Joshua, We are thy servants. And Joshua said unto them, Who are ye? And from whence come ye? And they said unto him, From a far country. Thy servants are come because of the name of the Lord thy God, for we have heard the fame of him and all that he did in Egypt, and all that he did to the two kings of the Amorites that were beyond Jordan, to Sihon, king of Heshbon, and to Og, king of Bashan, which was at Ashtaroth. Wherefore our elders and all the inhabitants of our country spake to us, saying, Take victuals with you for the journey, and go to meet them, and say unto them, We are your servants. Therefore now make ye a league with us. This our bread we took hot for our provision out of our houses on the day we came forth to go unto you. But now, behold, it is dry and it is moldy, and these bottles of wine which we filled were new, and behold, they be rent, and these our garments and our shoes are become old by reason of the very long journey. Now, I know that was a lot, but we're going to go ahead and start breaking this down so we can see everything. But before we do that, I want to start with just a quick question for you this morning. Have you ever made a decision that in the moment it just made sense? Maybe you looked at everything. You thought it through. You felt good about your decision. But later on, you realized that the decision you made was completely wrong. You weren't wrong because you didn't stop to think about it. You actually tried your best, and you did that part to try to think about what you were about to do. But you were wrong because what you based your decision on, it wasn't the full information. You didn't get to see the whole story. That is where this chapter is going. If you can think back to maybe times in your lives where you made a decision and then you come to realize later on that, okay, I made the wrong decision maybe because I didn't get to see the whole picture. Maybe there's things that I didn't know before I made this decision. That is where we are this morning. So now look back at verse 1. It says that when all the kings on that side of Jordan heard what had happened, they gathered themselves together to fight against Joshua and Israel. Right away you get to see what's happening because these nations had heard about what God has done. They heard about Jericho. They heard about Ai, and they're probably getting pretty worried after hearing all of this. So they decide to come together and team up with the other surrounding kingdoms. Whatever differences these people may have had before, because the thing about kingdoms is they like to fight. They have differences and they go at each other. It's been that way for as long as we can go back to and see. These people, they had these differences before. They had been fighting, but all of that doesn't matter now because now they have a common enemy, and that's Israel. So they lay everything aside, all their differences, all their fighting, they lay it all aside and they work together. And when I hear this, when I hear, what they had done, I feel like their response, it was completely understandable. They heard what had happened, they heard how it happened, they know what's coming for them, and they understand that if God is fighting for Israel, it's only a matter of time before they're the next target. So to protect themselves, they think, well, maybe if we work together, maybe if we just bound together as a united kingdom against them, maybe we're going to have a better chance. Now you have to picture Israel's side of things. This is what they would have been expecting. This is what they would have been preparing against. They were thinking that there was going to be a group of kingdoms coming against them, and they were prepared for war. That is what they thought that was going to happen. They thought that these kingdoms are going to come together and they're going to fight and it's going to be this war against them. But then when you go to verse 3, you see that this story goes into a different direction. Because what they were expecting was kind of an enemy who was going to come in and kind of threaten them and try to go to war and attack them and battle and everything. That is what they pictured in their mind. But then when you go to verse 3, it says that the inhabitants of Gibeon, they heard the same thing. They heard the same news that the other kingdoms have heard. They heard about Jericho, how the walls fell, and they just ran in and took the city. They heard about Ai, and how they drew the men out, and then they just went in and they took the city. But the inhabitants of Gibeon, they don't respond like the rest of them. They don't get ready to gear up and to go fight with the other kingdoms. They start thinking about a way to get around it. And in verse 4 it says that they did work willily. Now I know we don't use that word very often anymore, and to be honest, I had to look it up to make sure, what does this actually mean? But it was what it means is that they acted with deception. They were being sneaky. They came up with a plan and they got creative with it. And look at what they do. It says that they take old sacks, old wineskins that are torn and patched. They put on worn out clothes and worn out shoes, and they bring bread that is dry and moldy. When you read this, you can kind of picture it in your head of what these people would have looked like. When they came in, everything about them would have looked like they have been traveling for a long, long time. And that's exactly what they were wanting Israel to believe. They really make it look like these people, they are not from around here. And then when you get down to verse 6, this is exactly what they say to them. They say, we be come from a far country. We're not from around here. We've been traveling for so long. It says, now therefore make ye a league with us. So they're saying, we've traveled all this way to come and to ask you to make peace with us. This group, when they got into town, they didn't look like the threat that Israel was prepared for. I'm sure that they were just gearing up and preparing for, man, I couldn't imagine if kingdoms are gathering together against you. I couldn't imagine what that would look like, but that's what they were picturing. They're like, man, all these thousands of people are going to come together and it's going to be some giant war that we're about to be in. That's what they pictured. But they didn't realize, that the enemy that was coming, they didn't come bearing threats. These people that showed up, they didn't look like what they were expecting. They didn't look like the threat that came in with swords and armor and ready to go at it. These people looked like they had been traveling. And based on all of their resources that it lists that they brought, it's pretty clear that these people didn't come to fight. But even then, even after them saying, well, we've come from a far country and we've come to ask you to make an agreement with us, even then, the main pushback would be, and it's what Joshua asks him, he's pretty much like, well, who are you? We don't even know who you are, and here you are, you just show up and you're asking us to essentially make a peace treaty with you? The leaders of Israel, they would have had their guard up about these people. Who wouldn't? These people come up out of nowhere and all of a sudden they're talking to you and say, well, make peace with me. Make a league with us is how they say it. It's like, I don't even know where you come from. I don't know who you are. They would have had their guard up about these people. But then they start talking about God. They say, we've heard of the name the Lord your God. We've heard what he did in Egypt and what he did to those kings on the other side of Jordan. So now, this whole story, it's not just that these people came from a far distance and they traveled to come and ask for peace. Now it starts to sound spiritual. This is them trying to connect with Israel on a more personal level. And it sounds like they respect God. And it sounds like, he is the main reason why they came. He said, well, we heard all of this and we had to come. That's how they pictured it for them. And then, just to try to convince them of the story even more, they try to point out all of the things that they brought with them. They say, look at this old moldy bread. When we left the house, this was fresh and it was hot. They say, look at these wineskins that we brought. When we took them, they were brand new, and now they're old and they're worn out, and we've had to patch them because they're leaking. They said, look at these clothes, look at these shoes, look at everything that we have. And honestly, it was really convincing. Everything that they had, it looks like it's backing up their side of the story. And that's when you have to stop and think for a second. If you were standing there, what would you think about this? What decision would you make? Because you just met these people for the first time. They haven't given you a reason not to trust what they're saying. And based on what they're saying and based on how they look, it all makes sense, right? So now Israel, they have that decision that they have to make. They have to decide what they're going to do with these people. So, read with me the second part, verses 14 and 15. And it says, and the men took of their victuals and asked not counsel at the mouth of the Lord. And Joshua made peace with them and made a league with them to let them live. And the princes of the congregation swear unto them. They make their decision. Joshua agrees and they make their league, they make their oath with these people. But I hope that you caught that. I kind of read it a little quickly on purpose, but I hope you caught right there in the middle of verse 14 something that should really, really stand out to you all who have been following this series with us. It says, they did not ask counsel from the Lord. You would think, after everything that just happened in chapter 7, after seeing what can happen when you move forward without going to God first, you think that they would be a little bit more careful here. You would think that at the very least, they would have had just a short moment where they would stop and say, well, let's just be sure. Let's go to God and ask him first, because we made a quick decision last time and it didn't end well for us. When we think of common sense, we think that is what they should have had. But they didn't. They never stopped. It says that they didn't take counsel from the Lord. And I think part of the reason for this is because in their mind, this doesn't feel like a big, major decision. To them, this feels small. It feels simple. These people, they don't look like a threat. They're saying that they came from a faraway country, and they're saying that they came because they respect our God, and they're asking us for peace. Everything about this looks like a no-brainer. And I'll be honest, I think the Gibeonites, I think they did a really, really good job with this plan because they thought of everything. It all lined up. It all made sense. And they really made it look like a situation where Israel wouldn't even have to second-guess their decision. And that's probably the main reason why it ended up the way that it did. Why would we need to go to God about something like this? They would think, this isn't a battle. This isn't a crisis. It's not something that feels overly complicated. It's just a simple decision, right? So they make their decision. They're going to let these people live. And they swear an oath to them. And then they move forward with it. When we read a story like this, we have to stop for a moment and just self-reflect. Because this happens all the time in our own lives. It's not always the obvious things that trip us up. Sometimes it's the little things. It's the things that just seem so straightforward, like we've got everything figured out. We're just going to just make our own decision. And instead of slowing down and bringing it before God, we just go with what makes sense to us. And the problem with that is just because something makes sense to you doesn't mean that you should move forward with it without God. Because that's exactly what they do here. This is exactly what Israel does in this story. They feel confident about their decision, so they moved forward. And once they did, the deal was done. So let's see what happens next. We're going to read the rest of this chapter, starting in verse 16. And bear with me, because I've tried to read this so many times, but man, these are some hard names to get through. So bear with me. Starting in verse 16, and it says, "And it came to pass at the end of 3 days, after they had made a league with them, that they heard that they were their neighbors, and that they dwelt among them. And the children of Israel journeyed, and came unto their cities on the 3rd day. Now their cities were Gibeon, and Chephirah, and Beeroth, and Kirjath-jearim. And the children of Israel smote them not, because the princes of the congregation had sworn unto them by the Lord God of Israel. And all the congregation murmured against the princes. But all the princes said unto all the congregation, We have sworn unto them by the Lord God of Israel, now therefore we may not touch them. This we do to them. We will even let them live, lest wrath be upon us, because of the oath which we swear unto them. And the princes said unto them, Let them live, but let them be hewers of wood and drawers of water unto all the congregation, as the princes had promised them. And Joshua called for them, and he spake unto them, saying, Wherefore have ye beguiled us, saying, We are very far from you, when ye dwell among us? Now therefore ye are cursed, and there shall none of you be freed from being bondmen, and hewers of wood, and drawers of water for the house of my God. And they answered Joshua and said, because it was certainly told thy servants how that the Lord thy God commanded his servant Moses to give you all the land and to destroy all the inhabitants of the land from before you. Therefore we were sore afraid of our lives because of you, and have done this thing. And now behold, we are in thine hand. As it seemeth good and right unto thee to do unto us, do. And so did he unto them, and delivered them out of the hand of the children of Israel, that they slew them not. And Joshua made them that day hewers of wood and drawers of water for the congregation and for the altar of the Lord, even unto this day, in the place which he should choose. Now, as we get into this last section here, we see that this is where everything gets exposed. Remember, they already made their decision. You got to read that in verses 14 and 15. They already made that decision. They've already given their word, and they've already made their oath with these people. But just a few days later, they find out the truth. It says after 3 days, they heard that these people, they weren't from some faraway country. They were essentially their next door neighbors. When you look at it, it says, they were Gibeonites. It says what their countries are. But, Gibeon, when you look at it, was only about 15 to 20 miles away from Gilgal, where this whole chapter was playing out. People could travel 15 to 20 miles easily in a day. I'm thinking about the marathon that's coming up. What is it, the Flying Pig? We just talked to Michael about it the other day, and he's about to prepare for that. That's 26 miles that people are going to run. So 20 miles, if you say it's even that far, isn't that bad. They are literally their next door neighbors. Everything that they just heard from them a couple days ago, everything that they believed about them is a lie. And now they know about it. And then to make things even more difficult, they've already made their oath with these people. They've already swore to the Lord God of Israel with these people. They've already acted upon it. They acted upon the information that they believed to be true. They've made a decision. Now they have to decide how they're going to handle this situation. If they would have found this out prior, if they would have found this out when the people had first come in and they were trying to ask them for peace, then this whole situation would have been completely different. But they didn't know all that. They didn't find out until just a couple days later, until after it was already too late. There's no turning back from this. And we can see that the people, they get upset about it. There's murmuring going on because now people understand what has happened. They understand that they've been lied to. The people also know and they remember this is not what God would have wanted them to do. In fact, when you look at it, God actually warned them specifically not to swear any oaths or to make any covenants with these people in the land. He told them specifically not to do that. And here, they've already messed that up. But the leaders, they step in and they tell the whole congregation of Israel, and they say, we've already swore to them by the name of the Lord. And we are not breaking that. We are bound by it. Even though they were deceived, they were lied to, they still keep their word because they took their word very, very seriously back then. They took their oaths very seriously. I wish this was something that people would take a little bit more seriously nowadays. And this is where the story, it gets difficult for Israel. Because now they've made a decision and they're stuck with it. What are they going to do? They can't undo it. They can't go back and fix it. They just have to live with it. They're not going to break their word. And what they've decided, what they've done, it's not just a small thing. It's not like one of those small decisions where you make it, but it's something that you don't really see every day, so you can just kind of ignore it. I know we've all had like little decisions like that. We're like, it's like that. But this wasn't a small decision that they made. This isn't something that they're just not ever going to see. This is something that they have to live with. Because now these people, they're living in the land. They took these people in and said, we're going to make peace with you. And now these people are living as if they are a part of Israel. These people are now going to be in their lives moving forward. And that is a pretty big deal if you ask me. It's not something that you're going to ignore. Now you're going to have to deal with these people for the rest of your life. That's a pretty big deal. And all of that comes down because of one decision. But then Joshua talks to them. He talks to the people who had lied to them, and he asks them, he said, why did you do it? Essentially that's what he's saying. And their answer is honest. They say, we knew what God had said. We knew, what he was going to do. He was going to give you the land, and he told you to slay all the inhabitants of the land, and we were afraid for our lives. That is why they did this. When you hear that, one way you could look at it is saying, well, at least these people knew something about God. They knew that he was real. They heard about what God had said, what God had promised them. They heard about what he has already done for them. And they believed it all enough to where they were afraid for their lives. So much so that they came up with this elaborate story. And man, it was elaborate. It was a great story if you ask me. They were trying to do whatever they could just to avoid what was about to happen to them. But Israel, they uphold their end of their oath, and Joshua doesn't destroy them. But he does punish them for what they have done because they did lie. And he tells them now that since they're living in the land, they're going to be servants. They're going to work and they're going to serve the people of Israel. And that's exactly what happens in this story. But even then, they've now still have to live with the fact that these people, they shouldn't have been there. But now they're living in the land. And it all goes back to that one decision. Sometimes I think back in my life and I'm like, man, if I would have made that one decision differently, all of this would have been different. I bet that just replays over and over in their head that they think, man, all of this because of one decision. Now, when we look at this story isn't just about them getting lied to. Because we read this, this is their story that we get to read and to understand. This isn't just about them getting lied to. There are takeaways from what we see. This is about how easy it is to make a decision that feels right in the moment and not realize until later that you've just made a big mistake. Think about it. When they were there, they were talking to these people, everything made sense. Nothing seemed off. If I was there, I would have believed it too. Because I read this, I'm like, man, they made it look good. I would have believed it. I would have believed them because I had no reason not to. But they didn't have the full picture. They didn't get to see everything. That's why it's so dangerous about deception. Because how would they have known that? If someone is trying to be deceitful, how are you going to know that? All they knew is what they were telling them. How would they have known the truth unless someone told it to them? So they made this decision, they moved forward with it, and now they're dealing with the consequences. And that is a part that'll definitely stick with them. You don't always feel the consequences of your decisions in the moment that you make them. Sometimes you feel it later. And in this case, in their case, they felt it days later, and they are going to be feeling that for a very, very long time. And I'm sure that you've already been able to see it for those that have been with us. I'm sure you can already see another issue in this, and I hope that you can. But this story comes down to another issue that we've already seen them fall into before. They didn't go to God. This is the same thing that got them in trouble in chapter 7. You would think, we're only in chapter 9. You would think when you're reading this story, you're like, man, how could they be so careless? How could they do something like this again? It just happened back in chapter 7. They got into this battle and they lost 36 of their men. How could they be careless? But you know, when you really have to think about this and get deep into it, what if they were trying to be careful? What if they were trying to protect themselves from making that same mistake in chapter 7? You know, this would explain everything in chapter 8. It would explain how at the end of chapter 8 they remembered the words of Moses and they followed them. Then instead of going forward, they stopped and they went back to God because they were trying to protect themselves. But what they failed to see is how the enemy wasn't acting the same. You know what? The enemy in chapter 8, they forgot and they didn't realize that God was giving them a different method. He was giving them different instructions on the battle. Well, now Israel is falling into that same trap. What they had pictured in their head was people coming in with swords and armor ready to battle. They didn't think that they would come in and they would just be in old, raggedy, torn up clothes trying to lie to them. They didn't go to God because they didn't think that they needed Him. They probably thought that this was something so simple. You know, why would we need to go to Him? How many times have we done that in our own lives? We're all the same way. You know, when something feels serious to us, we'll stop. If it's a big issue in our lives, we will stop and we'll pray because it's kind of an obvious sign to us. All right, this is something big. I need to stop. I need to ask God. You know, hopefully you're searching in God's Word saying, all right, what does the Word have to say about my situation? We go when it's big issues, or if something feels uncertain, we'll go before God. But when something looks simple, and when it seems to make sense to us, that's when we will just go with it. That's exactly what they did, and now they're dealing with the consequences. Last thing, I promise, but one final thing I want you to see in this story, because I don't want us to miss it, because it's clear that they made a mistake. But they didn't make another mistake to try to cover this one up. They honored their word. They honored the oath that they made with the Gibeonites, and we can see that God didn't walk away from them. You know, actually, I know I study a lot and get into it, but actually, if you follow through this story, you can see, you know, if you're interested, if you go into 2 Samuel, you can see that God actually holds them to this oath that they made with the Gibeonites. You know, eventually Israel tries to turn and King Saul tries to attack them. And when they try to attack them, God punishes Israel because now they're breaking their oath that they just made in this chapter. I think that's really, really neat. I don't know, I get into it. So Israel honors their oath. And God honors their decision to keep their word. And He continues to work through it. You know, I really like how it says at the very end in verse 27, it says, Joshua made them hewers of wood and drawers of water for the congregation and for the altar of the Lord. You know, these people, not only were they there and they were working, but they were also working right alongside the things of God. They were serving the altar of the Lord. Doesn't mean what Israel had done was right. But what it does show is that even when we get something wrong, God is still able to work through it. I don't know about you this morning, but I am grateful to hear that this morning. I was so happy and very relieved when I was reminded of this. Because let me tell you, in case that you've never heard it before, in case you've never really stopped and thought about it, we're not always going to get this right. There are going to be times in our lives where we look back and say, well, I could have handled that, or maybe I should have handled that situation differently. You're saying maybe I should have slowed down before I just did whatever I decided to do. I should have slowed down and went to God first. I should have prayed about it first. There are going to be moments in our lives when we realize that we've missed something. Maybe we had an opportunity and we didn't see it. Or maybe we saw it, but we just failed to act on it. This is just being real. This is real examples that we have in our own lives. But I am thankful for the reminder today that despite all of that, despite all of my potential mistakes that I'm going to make, that God is still faithful. We can see that even here. Israel gave their word. Even though it cost them, they kept their word. They didn't go back on it, and then God holds them to it. God continued to work despite their mistakes. And I think, when you look at that part of the story, it kind of points you to something a little bit bigger. God always keeps His word. He doesn't change His word. He doesn't go back on it. And He doesn't fail in it. And that is where our hope is. We have hope that God is faithful to His promises and that He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. I am so thankful to be reminded of that this morning. We are not perfect. We never will be perfect. We are going to miss things. We're going to make mistakes. But God is still faithful to what He said. Every single time. Now, I don't want you, because I know how that would maybe sound if you take it the far way, but I don't want you to leave here thinking, well, I'm just going to do whatever I want, and God's going to work it out. Because no, we're not called to do that. These people, they were trying to do what they felt was right, and they made the wrong decision. And yes, they had to live with that decision. They did it before. God had to punish them, bring them back on the right track. Yes, we can't just do whatever we want and say God's going to figure it out. That's not what this is. What this is a reminder for us to go to God in everything. Everything that we do, God cares about every part of our lives. He doesn't care just about the big things. We go to Him with the big things, but He doesn't just care about that. He cares about the small things too. The simple things that we don't think really matters. He cares about that. God cares about everything. He cares about it all. We need to bring everything before Him and just ask for His guidance. Not just because we feel like we need it, but we need to go to Him all the time. So, as we come to a close this morning, I just want to ask you this one final question. Is there something in your life right now where you've already made a decision and you're having to live with it? If you're being honest, maybe you wish that you could go back. You wish that you would have slowed down. You wish that you would have done something differently, but you can't. It's already been done. And now you're carrying the weight of that decision with you. Listen, if that's you this morning, I want you to know that you are not the only one. What we see in this story here and what we see in this chapter is this is exactly where Israel is. They made a decision, now they're living with it. But what I want you to see is this. Even there, God doesn't walk away from them. And He's not going to walk away from you either. If you're here this morning and that is you, You don't have to sit there and just carry the weight of that decision anymore. This is your moment to come to Him and say, God, I've been carrying this for maybe a long time, but I am laying this down. Maybe you need help. This is the time where you can come back to Him and you can fix it. This is when you can just bring it to God. Lay it down at His feet. Ask Him to help you move forward from here. Saying, God, I don't know where to go from here. I'm telling you, sometimes in our lives, that is exactly where we need to be. Sometimes we just need to get to a point where we just don't move any further until we come back to God and say, God, where do you want me to be? If that's you this morning, come. You can come to the altar. You can pray before Him. If you need someone to pray with you, I would love to pray with you. Before you go any further, before you decide to take another step, this is your time to just bring it to Him. You don't have to have all the right words. You don't have to have everything figured out. The one thing that I love to be reminded of so much is you just have to be willing. So if you're willing this morning, won't you come? This time is for you as we get a verse.